I'm Tori, and today I'm going to be reviewing the first 4 books in the Wizard of Oz series. So these are the books that the movie The Wizard of Oz is based on. The movie is based on the first one. This series was written by L. Frank Baum. The first book came out in 1900 and they progressed over time after that. And I listened to the audiobooks for free on LibriVox because these books are in the public domain. So I really love this series. These books are so imaginative and creative, and these would be very good stories for children. You know, they're kids' stories, things happen like that. But then there's a lot of kind of nuanced humor that's specifically for adults, and a lot of kind of little jokes and comments on society and the way the world works that are really fun to read as an adult. So when most people think of The Wizard of Oz, they think of the movie that came out in 1939 with Judy Garland, and that movie is based on this first book. I would say that this first book is kind of an introduction to the world of Oz, and when I read it, I couldn't stop comparing it to the movie. And I think that's fine, you know, because this book is not the strongest in the series. Mostly you're just kind of getting used to the world and getting used to the way that it's different from the movie. And to me, this book is kind of a good little introduction to give you a taste of Oz. And then the series really picks up in the next books, and the world is so complex and creative and strange and interesting and whimsical. And it's just so delightful to get farther into the series and learn more and more about this world. So the first book is The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. It was published in 1900, and it is very similar to the movie. There are some differences. The movie feels like it has this overarching villain of the Wicked Witch, you know, she's going to try to get Dorothy. And the book is kind of more episodic. You go through a series of adventures, and the witch is one of the last ones, so she's kind of happens at the climax of the book, but she doesn't like stalk Dorothy throughout the series as much. It feels more like Dorothy just goes through a series of little misadventures with her friends. Another difference is that the shoes were silver. I don't know if this is true or not, but I heard that the reason they changed it to ruby in the movie was that the ruby slippers showed up so much more. They were trying to showcase their gorgeous new color technology, and the slippers showed up much more in that. I do think the movie uses black and white very well, because when this book describes Dorothy's life in Kansas, her life that she's talking about is incredibly gray, and Dorothy lives in this gray place with these gray people, and so I think the movie portrayed that very well. Another difference is that in the movie, you're not quite sure if the whole thing was a dream, and the people she meets are kind of representations of farmhands. And in the book, Uncle Henry and Aunt Em are the only characters you meet in the real world. And the characters in Oz are definitely their own people. They live in Oz. They were definitely not a dream, and they don't have real world counterparts. So this first book is very cute and whimsical, and it's a nice little introduction, and then you really get into the series. So I started reading these books as a child. I'm not sure exactly when I read them, but I do know that I was younger than 11. And so when I read them as, I don't know, an 8 or 10-year-old, somewhere in there, I thought the series was kind of cute, and it was a little fantasy story, and I remember getting a little bored with it. And I think that's because you just have these cutesy little adventures, you know, and like as a child you could read them just like a couple of chapters at a time and, you know, go on little adventures, and a little kid could say, okay, they're having adventures. But now, reading these books for the second time, there's such great nuanced humor in here, and it can get fairly dark. Like at one point we meet a character who is a kind of like a scarecrow. He was a person who's created, and he has a pumpkin for a head. And he's very concerned because he knows he'll have a very short lifespan, because as soon as the pumpkin rots, he'll die. And so the book does go there, and it does kind of get into these dark things. And there'll be all these kind of little whimsical arguments that, there'll be like little jabs at politicians and all different kinds of things about life, about our culture and our society and how things work. And it's just this very clever little commentary hidden in this lovely children's story. And so it's just so much fun to read. The second book in the series is The Marvelous Land of Oz. This book came out in 1904, and it is my favorite of the ones I have read so far. It had just some great kind of sarcastic humor in there, and this book actually doesn't have Dorothy in it at all. In this book, we're just going back to the Land of Oz, And, you know, she kind of left the Scarecrow, the Tin Woodsman, and the Cowardly Lion in charge when she went back to Kansas. And so it's just kind of seeing how things worked out in Oz. And so in this book, the main character is actually a boy named Tip, and he has been raised by an evil witch named Mombi. And so this is the story of his adventures trying to go off into the world and escape her and live his own life. And so I loved watching the characters. We do see some of the characters who we've met before, and then we meet a lot of new characters. So I loved, one of my favorite new characters was a wooden sawhorse, who is just, you know, a wooden sawhorse for tools and stuff, and he is an actual character who runs around and can give people rides. I also love a character named Jack Pumpkinhead, who is kind of like a scarecrow except with a pumpkin for a head. And then my favorite character in this series is named General Ginger, and she is a bratty little girl who is leading an army of other little girls who are going to lay siege to Oz and take over the city. And they are going to do this armed with their horrible weapons of knitting needles. They just carry their knitting needles stuck in their hair, and they're going to go storm the city and get out their knitting needles and take control. And it's just hilarious. I love everything about General Ginger. The whole interaction is just amazing. And throughout this book, all the characters are looking for the lost princess Ozma, who is supposed to be the ruler of Oz. That's the reason that in the first book, the Wizard of Oz could take over. It's because no one knew where Ozma was, and she's the one who's supposed to be ruling. And right now, Dorothy's friends from the first book are kind of trying to rule, but they're not great at it. So it would be really good if we could find Ozma. So that's kind of what this whole journey is about. And just something about the tone. It's the perfect balance between whimsical, but then almost a little bit dark. And I just like that. And it's just such an enjoyable book. The third book in the series is Ozma of Oz, which came out in 1907. And in this book, we are reintroduced to Dorothy. Now we meet her. She is on a ship with her uncle, and they are traveling to go somewhere, I don't remember why. And she and the little yellow hen that she is traveling with get washed overboard somehow. They're floating in the ocean, and they find themselves back kind of in the fairylands of Oz, of Oz. We start to learn that Oz is just one country in this whole world of different fairylands, and so you can go to all different countries, and Oz is just one little part of it, and the world is actually much bigger. And it's really interesting, if you look at the cover art on these books, in the original one, they draw Dorothy with like brown hair, and she's this cute little kind of petite girl. And in this one, she looks a lot older. She has kind of blonde hair, and the two characters just look quite different. And I think that is a smart choice on the artist's part, because it feels like Dorothy is kind of a different little girl. So I feel like when this first book came out, L. Frank Baum was just kind of getting used to the idea of Dorothy and kind of playing around. And then by this book, he really decided what he wanted the character to be and what traits he wanted her to have. So it feels like she's just a little bit more developed in this book, and she has a lot more of a personality in this book, and she's much more interesting. But she's definitely not quite the same Dorothy that we had in the first book. And an interesting thing about Dorothy from here on out is that, as well as all these other changes, the author also decided that she shouldn't be quite as educated as she sounded in the first book, and so she has a very colloquial way of speaking, which would be fine, but it's written in print. Like, I'm very picky when I see like accents portrayed in writing, and sometimes it's done well and you can just kind of catch the flow of it and it doesn't make you stop. Here in these books, it actually made it really hard. Like, I would get stuck like seeing the words on the page that were just like half words or misspelled to make you pronounce them the way she talks, and that made it hard for me to read these books. And that's actually why I stopped reading the series when I was like 9 or however old I was. I got annoyed having to read through that. But now, since I'm listening to these on audiobook, I like it so much better because it really is interesting to hear Dorothy talk like that, and I don't have to try to parse through the words on the page to make them sound like it. They just read that to me, and so I like that much better. So for these books especially, I recommend them as an audiobook because then you don't have to try to read Dorothy's dialogue. And so in this book, Dorothy and her little yellow hen, who is named Bellina, end up in a land called Ev, and they go through this whole adventure trying to rescue the local princess from the evil Gnome King. And in the course of their adventures, they actually meet up with Ozma, who is now ruling Oz. I would say spoilers, but the title is in the book, so if you read the titles of the first 3 books, you know that Ozma appears by this book because her name's in the title. And so you meet up with Ozma and all of her entourage. And so Dorothy and Ozma have this whole little adventure in the land of Ev. And then I believe they make their way back to Oz. I don't remember where they go after that. But, you know, they have all these different little adventures working things out. This book does a lot to kind of expand the world of Oz and the surrounding countries. The land of Ev is really interesting. I loved it in the Gnome King's palace. He has this beautiful treasure room full of all these different trinkets. And there's this whole scene where Dorothy and her friends have to go in and try to guess which of the treasures are members of the royal family who have been transformed and imprisoned. And if they guess right, then that family member will be freed. And if they guess wrong, then they will be transformed as well. And so that was a very, very interesting and little scene, and I liked that a lot. I also think it's interesting here, Dorothy meets a princess who has something like 30 different heads. And so when she's very vain, and when she wants to change the way she looks, she'll just take her head off and switch it out for a different head. And the personalities of those heads influence the princess, but she is still the same person. And she decides that Dorothy looks nice and might want to have her head as well to add to her collection. And so I love that because it's whimsical and fun, but it has a bit of an edge to it too. It's just a little bit creepy, and it's the perfect balance. Another new character I loved in this book is TikTok, who is a clockwork man who has to be wound regularly or he'll just stop, and he's a very fun character. So the 4th book in the series is Dorothy and the Wizard in Oz, which was published in 1908, and this is the last book that I read when I was a child. I don't actually remember if I finished it or not. The beginning sounded familiar. I don't know if I got to the end or not. I don't remember. So this book has a very interesting title because it is called Dorothy and the Wizard in Oz, and they don't actually spend very much time at all in Oz. Most of the book happens in other places. So this book starts with Dorothy being on vacation, and I think she's in San Francisco now, and she is in a cab, which is a carriage. So there's a cab horse named Jim who's pulling the cab, and she's with a boy named Zeb, and she has a little kitten named Eureka, and suddenly there is an earthquake, and all of them fall through the earth into a different kind of fairy kingdom in the center of the earth. And so this book is all about their adventures trying to get out of the center of the earth and meeting all the strange people there. And they encounter the wizard too. He is caught in the same series of earthquakes and gets stuck there as well. And so it's fun because this time on their adventures, they have Jim the cab horse pulling them around in their cart all through this. So they get to, there's significantly less walking in this book. They get to just ride along places, which is fun. And at these places in the center of the earth, they actually meet some very interesting different people. There's a place that has like almost no gravity. They can just like bounce around. There are all these glass houses. They meet a civilization that is entirely vegetable people. They don't have like flesh and blood. You cut them open and they're just a vegetable, and they reproduce by planting themselves and then growing new people on vines, and it's just very interesting. And I love the character of Eureka, Dorothy's kitten. L. Frank Baum obviously knew some real cats. He portrayed her so well because once animals go to Oz, they can talk. And you meet this kitten, and she's a little adorable kitten. She's nice and she's sweet, and she will happily eat an animal that's smaller than her. And she is very selfish and a little vain, and she's just so much like a real cat, and she's just such an amazing character. I love her so much, and it's just such a realistic portrayal of how cats feel about themselves in relation to the rest of the world and how they think they should get to conduct themselves. So Eureka is just an amazing character. So yes, these are all the books I have read in this series thus far, and I basically caught up to where I was last time I tried to read them, and so now I look forward to going on and reading the new books that I have never read before.